Jordan, I've got a bit of a bone to pick here.
With me?
Not with you. No, just something that's been on my mind over the last couple of days. Something kind of bothering me.
What is it?
Well, as you know, there's wildfires raging all across Canada right now. It was really affecting Alberta for a couple weeks. It's been affecting the East Coast, and now right here where I live in Quebec, there's massive wildfires going on. You know, it's a really scary time, and I don't know why this is, but I'm seeing all kinds of Americans weighing in on this, talking about the wildfires. And they don't live here. They don't live here, Jordan. So I don't see what I thought the rule was. This has been explained carefully to me many times. I thought the rule was you have to live in the place where the thing is going on, and then you can comment on it. And I see a number of people not abiding by this. It's kind of frustrating.
I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Yeah, this is...
Sorry. So you're telling me that the massive toxic cloud coming from Canada is hovering over America and affecting things there. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if there's some kind of an analogy. I wonder if there's some kind of an analogy that we could use here.
Sorry. Well, look who's on his high horse today.
I probably shouldn't be using this very serious, devastating environmental crisis to make a point about petty Twitter grievances and beefs, but I'm a petty guy, I guess. I don't know. I just couldn't resist.
How satisfied when you made that connection in your head? When was it, and how satisfied were you?
It was probably, I think it was sometime yesterday. Like when all the footage from New York was coming in with like all the apocalyptic yellow skies and the wood smoke covering the whole city. I was kind of like, okay, I got that Grinch face and the fingers are together. And I was really, okay, I'm going to let them have it. I'm going to put the system on trial.
This is my time to shine.
Yeah.
Oh, you got him. Everyone's on notice now.
Yeah, everyone's on notice.
It was.
No, it's,
it was bad though. Horrifying.
I know. Yeah.
I just got back to DC last night, and I had been in Texas the past several days. And in the Uber ride back to my apartment, you could see it. You could see this like haze over the city. And granted, DC didn't get it nearly as bad as New York or northeastern parts of the US, but still like really terrible. You're in Quebec. What is it like? How are you? How's your family feeling? How's everyone's throats? I hear it's hard to breathe up there.
Well, we're doing all right, honestly. Like, weirdly enough, like at the first couple of days, we definitely did have the kind of haze here, and you could smell the smoke, and we were definitely being affected by it. But over the last 2 days or so, when you look at like the climate map showing like where the smoke is going, it like curls totally around Montreal where I'm at. Even though I'm in Quebec, the cloud is like being blown away from the city and curling around. I'm in the nice, like breathable green zone. And then it's everyone on the Eastern Seaboard and New York City and DC and now Pennsylvania that's getting really the huge impact of it. You know, it's been not great here, but it's nowhere near as bad currently in Montreal as it is like in some places in the US. Although I'm not going to like do an end zone dance about it. It's literally just a matter of the wind changing at any moment, and then it could come right back over me. But in all honesty, it has not been that bad over the last couple of days. It's been significantly worse in New York and a lot of other places in the US.
Yeah. I have a buddy in Toronto, and he said the past couple of days it's been really brutal on his throat. Being outside for 10, 15 minutes felt like he had just smoked a couple of cigarettes, which is wild. How did this start? This is a wildfire, right?
Yeah. Like I said, there's been wildfires across Canada for the last couple of weeks. You know, it's a little unclear about how these things start. You know, it's how wildfires always start. There's lightning hitting dry areas. There's humans camping and not being careful with fires or cigarettes or whatever. Like we don't know. I mean, that's the kind of thing that becomes very confusing for people, right? When you talk about climate change, and you talk about the wildfire season and the way that in Canada, for example, right now, we're like 1,000% more land being burned by wildfire season than it has ever happened before this time of year, like in early June, like by several orders of magnitude. And the reason that's happening, they can start however fires normally start in forests, which is like not a new phenomenon, but because of the hot and dry climate, the less rain, there's these environmental factors that are exacerbated by climate change that are making the fires way easier to start and to spread way faster and to get out of control much quicker. So little unclear about how these things are starting. There's a lot of rampant speculation about that right now. But the reason that it's spreading and the reason that it's becoming is so dangerous so quickly is because of all these environmental factors that are being exacerbated by the changing climate.
And that's one of the many frustrating things about people's reactions to it, that we'll go through a few of them, but people trying to act like this has nothing to do with climate change and summarily dismissing it as arson. Like you say, it's very difficult and in some cases impossible to know how these start. But the effects of climate change make these worse. And you're seeing it not just in the US, not just in the Northeast, not just, smoke over New York. You're seeing it on the West Coast. We did an episode a couple years ago about the wildfires in Australia. You're seeing this all over the planet. And as we've so often talked about, these are the effects, and these are the manifestations of climate change. It's not just, the climate's changing, now a fire has spontaneously broken out. It is making these things worse and more frequent. And that's the point when people are talking about the dangers of climate change. It's things like this. But a lot of skeptics and cynics and people who maybe even know deep down the climate is changing, but because of a partisan bent can't accept or admit that, tried to dismiss this over the past couple of days just as arson. Or, in some cases, not a big deal at all.
Yeah. The reaction, as usual with any of these kinds of situations from conservative media, has been pretty incredible. And like you said, it spans that whole spectrum of this is not a big deal. It's nothing to worry about. There's always fires. Actually, wood fire smoke is good for you and it's not bad whatsoever. Particulate matter is just like a George Soros fantasy, conspiracy theory. It actually smells kind of nice, or it is bad and it's being started by arsonists. It's just like really going across the spectrum of conservative conspiracy and denialism.
Yeah. There was a guy who I know you featured on your Twitch stream, and I've seen clips shared around. There's a guy who was on Fox News last night talking about it, saying, it's no big deal. There are zero health consequences from people inhaling all of this wildfire smoke in cities like New York. And just a tiny amount of digging revealed that this guy previously worked in the coal industry and now works for or runs a fancy named think tank on the right, whose ultimate goal is to spin the conversation on climate change, deny human involvement and contribution on behalf of the oil, gas, and coal industries. And it's frustrating as we see the effects in real time. You're seeing horrific, like post-apocalyptic scenes in major cities, like we saw in San Francisco a couple of years ago. Really, we're seeing on the West Coast every year at this point now, like we saw in Australia a couple of years ago. And now this week in New York, there's an audience apparently for climate science denialism.
Yeah. And like, it's not just people like this that work for these kinds of like firms or that kind of are whose job it is to act as in this official capacity to show up on the media and basically, deny these things. Ultimately with the goal of rolling back regulations and legislation that's put into effect to kind of combat this problem. But it's like the whole, like the big part of the conservative media apparatus, it's not just this one guy or whatever. Like we've talked about before, we talked about this with Andrew Lawrence a couple of weeks ago, like the Daily Wire and all these conservative media influencers, they're basically like part of the PR wing of like the oil and gas industry and the fracking industry. And it's like there's this gigantic media apparatus that's been put into place, this infrastructure that's been put into place, from Fox News on the mainstream, going down to Newsmax, going into Daily Wire, and then funneling into this kind of like online conspiracy world. Who that's what their whole purpose is to obfuscate these things, to convince people that man-made climate change is just not even happening at all, or these major consequences that we're seeing, like the wildfires, are actually not that big of a deal. I mean, it's so sinister. And when you start to dig into some of the people that are like believe this stuff, you see how much it's like worked on them, and you see there's all these people online that have now acted basically as unpaid acolytes of the oil and gas industry to go in and spread these kinds of ideas and conspiracy theories. It's extremely sinister, and like it's depressing because like you really start to get the idea, as much as this has been a controversial issue, as much as people have been convinced that this is not a real thing, surely when they start physically seeing the consequences of it, when they open their door or their window and just seeing the changes that are happening, surely then maybe they'll start to ask some questions. They'll start to wonder if maybe they've been led astray or lied to. And really that is not what's going on. These same people are just doubling and tripling down. They're still denying it, even when it's right there in their face. It's extremely depressing, actually, to pay attention to it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it doesn't even seem like people being directly affected by this is going to make them change. And maybe it's because, unlike some issues, marriage equality, acceptance of same-sex marriage, for a lot of Republicans, it was someone in their family actually coming out that made them change. On gun violence, in many cases, definitely not all, because there are, in some mass shootings, victims' families who turn around and become like outspoken Second Amendment people. So it's definitely not all of them, but you do see a lot of people when it's impacting them, they become more involved. On this, I don't think it's going to be the same pattern, because the people who are going to be impacted directly first are less affluent, more likely to be a person of color or black. By the time it reaches people who are wealthy, affluent, white, conservative, for the most part, it's going to be, too late. So I just, what's a little smoke if they can escape it? What's a little like mild inconvenience from a wildfire if they can just jet set somewhere else to one of their other homes? It's an escapable problem for the wealthy, whereas, gun violence isn't. Like that person in your life is just now dead. And I don't know what it's going to take.
Even then, though, look no further than COVID and what we've seen with that, where you have people who you would think when their own family members or they themselves start getting this illness and getting severe health consequences from it, or even being hospitalized, intubated, or even fucking dying from it. And it just made them like all the double and triple down on the denial that it was even an issue in the first place. You had these incredibly bizarre scenes of people like trying to take their loved ones away from the hospital because they've convinced themselves that like the nurses or the doctors are somehow responsible for it. Like the cognitive dissonance has just gotten so extreme that even when people are being personally affected by this with people they love or they themselves, they still don't believe it. In fact, they continue to like be as fervent as ever in their denial that it's an issue at all.
Do you remember when Herman Cain died from COVID and his Twitter account was still auto posting stuff, including like COVID skepticism and posts questioning COVID's mortality rate? It's like, you're dead, sir.
Pretty on the nose. Yeah, exactly.
You died from this. And just like they all don't care. It's just because acknowledging that it was dangerous would force them to reconsider at that time one of the largest planks in their partisan platform, which was, we need to reopen. It's not a big deal. It's somehow a bioweapon from China and also not a big deal. And the most important thing we can do right now is get businesses booming again. And they wanted to die crushed in those gears of this capitalist machine to enrich corporation CEOs, the shareholders, just to get Applebee's back open. And they were fine being a human sacrifice on that blood altar.
Yeah, it's pretty grim stuff, I gotta say. No, and there's some real crossover with that. It's like the same thing with like this wildfire thing. Like you have like theories ranging from, or it's simultaneously. It's not even like people can hold these two thoughts in their mind at the same time. Like it's simultaneously dangerous and being started by climate activists in order to take away their rights and freedoms, and it's actually just a little wildfire smoke. It smells nice. It's a nice mesquite smell. It's a nice calming aura, or whatever that guy on Newsmax was saying about New York City. They're holding these ideas in their mind at the same time. You know, it's both dangerous and something that's being created by our perceived enemies, and it's simultaneously not a big deal at all. I was really diving into like the really wacky kind of conspiracy theory stuff about this on TikTok. Especially with these kind of like extreme reactionaries here in Canada. And it's pretty fascinating digging into like what they think is going on, which is if I can get it right, it's something like, so it's Justin Trudeau working with the like World Economic Forum, and they're starting the fires. And this is all being used as a distraction, basically, or as a way to get people back wearing masks again, because it's really important that to the government that everyone wears masks for some reason. We don't know why exactly, but that's what they want. They want to go into climate lockdowns because when people say like, you know, it's dangerous to go outside because of the smoke or potential harm you might have from wildfires, you should stay inside your house. Well, no, that's a climate lockdown. That's what the globalists want. And ultimately what they want, they don't want people living in these rural areas. No, they want to shepherd people into these 15-minute cities. They want to put people in these 15-minute cities where, and if you better be sitting down right now, because this is really terrifying stuff. One of these really scary 15-minute cities where you live somewhere and there's a bunch of green spaces around you and decent transit and all your amenities and grocery stores and your doctor is all like near you, so you don't have to spend your entire life driving in your car stuck in traffic. Well, this is actually this like devious George Soros World Economic Forum plot that's put into place. That's basically like a concentration camp. It's basically Auschwitz when you live in a city with a bunch of parks and infrastructure and grocery stores near where you live. This is the thing that these people have really latched onto. In the sort of post-COVID era, because all these people were complaining so much about the lockdowns and claiming that was part of some kind of plot. And then when all the lockdowns were totally lifted and all the mandates that they were complaining about were lifted, the mask mandates, the vaccine mandates, and they won and they got everything that they wanted. And we all just moved on and we opened up all the Applebee's and you can go and get a nice gigantic Bud Light anytime you want. Well, not Bud Light anymore, obviously, because they're woke, part of the woke mind virus or whatever. But they got everything they wanted, you know? But that wasn't enough because they still have to feel this constant sense of persecution. So this is what they've all moved on to now. We're being moved into these 15-minute cities where we're going to have all our movement tracked, and we're going to have to appeal to the commandant to get a pass to move into zone B to see our families or whatever. This is what these people are freaking out about. And they think that these wildfires are the new big puzzle piece, the new big puzzle piece to the 15-minute city conspiracy. It's really something else to dig into this stuff.
Well, I'm in. Just off that elevator pitch, I'm in.
Yeah.
You got me. So sign me up. Whatever I need to do, whatever I need to buy, or whoever I need to subscribe to learn the truth and stay plugged in. Just tell me where to send my money. That seems to be how all of these things work anymore. Just Let me know. I'm in. I like it.
Yeah. Well, I've been trying to go on TikTok myself and try and change people's hearts and minds and talk about these things. But would you believe that they're not really receptive to some of my ideas about this? And they, in fact, think that I'm one of the Trudeau socialist, globalist, authoritarian, jackbooted thugs or whatever it is. I don't know. Which I am. I mean, that's true.
I believe it.
They did kind of nail me on that one.
Maybe it's the medium. It could be.
Perhaps.
It could be how you're doing it. Have you tried doing it while dancing and like pointing at text that appears on screen? That might be.
You need to be in a truck with sunglasses, sometimes not wearing a shirt. That seems to be what really gets the traction on there. But I'm gonna keep working on this to infiltrate.
Well, I think you can pull it off.
Yeah.
In other news, did you hear, ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
We got him again. Yeah.
We got him
the documents.
Twice. The second time this year, Trump has been indicted now, this time in Miami, for his possession and handling of classified documents. Rob, how long until Trump is behind bars?
There's going to be a Cheeto in a jail cell. I just can't. I'm not going to get ever excited about this stuff because we just know that I really still don't think anything is going to lead to anything. I will be moved by one of these stories when there's actual legal repercussions for any of this stuff. Not that I think this classified document stuff is really that big of a deal. I see all these people getting all up in arms, these kind of liberals online. But how dare you have these classified documents? Like, I don't care about Trump having classified documents or what he was doing with them. Probably throwing around the nuclear codes at Mar-a-Lago, trying to impress like random jet ski dealers from Sarasota or whatever. But it's like it's they want this sort of surface level facade that they can like talk about how they're beginning all these legal repercussions, and he's going to have all these consequences. But ultimately, like if they don't actually follow through on anything, which seems to always be the case, if they don't actually stop him from running for president, then it doesn't really matter, and he's just going to still run. He's going to be the favorite until he's legally not allowed to run. And then once he's actually the president, like it's very unclear if that happens, when and if he does get to that point, it's going to be probably next to impossible to actually enact any kind of real consequences for any of this stuff, any of the corruption or the rampant criminality that was going on. So can't help but feel a little lackluster about this yet another story about the walls closing in and the orange man in the orange jumpsuit or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think it's funny. He's obviously not having a great time. He's been posting truths, which is what they call them on Truth Social, about how he's been indicted. In the past couple of days, he's been lashing out after it was made clear to him, I guess the other day, that this was happening. I'm just along for the ride. I'm going to watch it. I'm going to enjoy it. But I'm not going to get my hopes up. And it's not just him. He's not unique in being a powerful and or wealthy person who is somehow beyond reproach. Like, this is just, the whole system is like this. It's a two-tiered justice system.
Yeah.
If some lowly staffer did this, they'd be, they'd be in jail. I mean, we see that. Reality Winner is in jail for leaking classified documents.
Yeah. Or
a mishandling of classified documents. If you are powerless, yeah. Well, Snowden's not in jail, but definitely they want him to be.
They would love for him to be. Yeah.
But if you're powerful, wealthy, oh God, yeah. So you see it in how they've responded to things like leaks, ultimately mishandling of classified documents. They want to, if they want to claim it's espionage, let them. It's not, because both of them were doing it in a public service. Chelsea Manning, same thing. I don't care who the recipient was. I don't care if you allegedly think another country or an adversary benefited from the information. They put this information in the public light. Good on them. Outlets won Pulitzers. Multiple outlets won Pulitzers off of the Snowden reporting. Those reporters are fine, and they're moving on. But the guy who did it, he's the one that is a traitor. I don't buy it. And if you really want to throw the book at these people, do the same with a powerless or a powerful person. Until then, I'm not going to get my hopes up that this is somehow going to, end his political career, end his political aspirations. I hope it does, but I don't really have high hopes.
Well, it just seems like the people that are making these decisions are still so wedded to these kinds of norms and respecting of these institutions that even if they have evidence that Trump did engage in criminal behavior, they still see it as almost like too uncouth to actually enact real consequences for someone who they deem a political enemy. That's like, oh, that's only what happens in these banana republics, like these authoritarian countries or whatever. Even though really what happens is the kind of rampant corruption that goes on in the U.S. government is just totally normalized, which Trump is a part of, but which a lot of people in the U.S. government are also significantly a part of as well. So I think that's part of it also. They don't want to open the door to really prosecute the real corruption that was going on, because it's certainly not just Donald Trump that's got his finger in the pie there, or whatever the analogy you want to make. There's a whole lot of people on both sides of the aisle in the U.S. government that are engaging in that kind of open corruption. And if they really went after that, it would not just be Donald Trump that would be caught in the crossfire of it.
Right. Well, both of these stories that we've talked about, the opportunists in DC who are trying to spin the conversation around climate change to, the craziness and bonanza of the Trump world, and people who have built careers for themselves in this resistance to Trump, benefiting from that. All of those, including some really funny character arcs, can be found in Ben Terris's new book, The Big Break: The Gamblers, Party Animals, and True Believers Trying to Win in Washington While America Loses Its Mind. I sat down with Ben, and we've got a conversation for you coming up between him and me. And I just finished this book today, and let me tell you, I fucking loved it. It takes you through the past couple years for people like Matt Schlapp, the CPAC guy, Sean McElwee, the abolish ICE turned, hey, let's not talk about defunding the police guy. Yeah. And then some people who you may not know. Leah Hunt Hendricks, who is a progressive funder power player who is also the granddaughter of formerly the richest person on the planet and an oil tycoon. Robert Strick, who I had never heard of, but ended up being one of the most successful lobbyists during the Trump years, and he kind of faked it until he made it. Some really funny stories in this book, and Ben and I sat down to talk about it. It was interesting to hear from his perspective about some of these people he spent the past couple of years with. I'm really, really looking forward to people hearing this conversation. It was great.
Cool. I'm really looking forward to hearing it as well, actually.
But before we do that, just want to remind people our most recent premium episode that came out earlier this week with Ken Klippenstein, who, as a reminder, is still banned from the show. We just had to make an exception.
He can't keep getting away with this.
He's just out of control. About the presidential campaigns of RFK Jr. and Cornel West, and the role that third parties or independent candidates can play as spoilers potentially in this race. The DHS, the report on Cop City protesters and how they cribbed Andy Ngo's reporting, and a whole lot more about the debt ceiling negotiations and how it's all a charade and a scam. It was a ton of fun. The episode is available for paid subscribers, or as we like to call you, our paid interns, over at insurgentspod.com. You can go there, get access to that episode and every paid episode for just $5 a month. You help keep this show going. We greatly appreciate your support. Without you, we would not be able to do this. So insurgentspod.com, just $5 a month to get access to that episode and every other bonus episode. You get one extra every week.
Yeah, it was a great conversation with Ken. Although I must say, with Ken continually coming back on here, despite the ban, it almost seems like we're the scam cucks here. We're being made fools of.
I think that's right.
It's ridiculous. But yes, we do love and appreciate all our wonderful paid interns. I hope everyone gets a chance to listen to that episode. And now Jordan's conversation with Ben Terris, author of The Big Break, will be happening right after this.
And now we're joined by Ben Terris, author of the new book, The Big Break: The Gamblers, Party Animals, and True Believers Trying to Win in Washington While America Loses Its Mind. Ben, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. I just finished this book. I loved it. We'll get to it in a second, but first we have to ask you the question we ask all of our guests, just so we know who we're dealing with and whether or not the interview should even proceed. Ben, are you a gamer?
A gamer? Oh boy. I mean, am I going to answer this wrong? Not really. No, I'm not really a gamer. Have I played games? Sure. Yeah. But I wouldn't go so far as to say gamer.
Okay. But you have played, what, I assume in your childhood or maybe college days, what
Sure.
did you play?
Really post-college, I got super into Grand Theft Auto for a while. And it was like, honestly, it was between college and figuring out what I was going to do, and I became amazing at Grand Theft Auto. And look, was there some cannabis usage? Probably. Did I feel like I was in a movie when I was playing it? Probably. Look, the Washington Post, they made drug tests, so this is all hypothetical and probablys. Sure. But at that point, I think I probably qualified as a gamer. Now, got 2 little kids, and like I definitely help them out with the games on their tablets. They will for sure be gamers. I'm just not much of one myself.
Okay, so you're in retirement, but once a gamer, always a gamer.
That's right. And like I want to play Zelda. Like I just desperately want to see what everybody is all like, into. I just haven't had the time at the moment.
I understand. You haven't had the time in part because you just put out this fantastic book. I just finished it today. I loved it. I love books like this, where you do these deep dives, it's kind of vignettes on people who maybe many people nationwide don't know who they are, but they do have, in some instances, outsized influence on our politics or our society. And in this book, you talk about a few different people. There are 2 I want to start with and kind of juxtapose. This is Matt Schlapp and Leah Hunt Hendricks. I think most listeners know who Matt Schlapp is. He ran CPAC. He's a big conservative figure. He was close to Trump for years. And we obviously recently saw a lot of scandals emerge about him. I don't think, even for a left-leaning show, people know who Leah Hunt Hendricks are. Could you give us an overview of who these people are and kind of how they might mirror each other?
Yeah. Well, first, just to start, to kind of give a premise of the book here, it is a lot of characters like them. Thank you for reading it and for saying nice things about it. I appreciate it. I was really looking for characters that could be both entertaining, interesting, filled with drama. There's a lot of books that come out about Washington, and a lot of them feel the same to me. Another book about Trump, another book about a crazy thing that happened, and a hurricane was almost nuked, or documents were flushed down the toilet, which again are like amazing stories or whatever. But it's not the kind of story I wanted to write. I wanted to write about the people that actually make Washington work, the people that make Washington not work, the kind of, thank you for smoking type characters, right? The weirdos. I mean, at one point the subtitle was going to be weirdos, wonks, and wannabes, right? Like the people who just are filled with drama and strivers and will let me into their world and show me just how absolutely bizarre and Veep-like and dark and funny at the same time Washington could be. And so Matt Schlapp obviously fits that bill, right? He's, as you mentioned, the Republican kind of kingmaker of sorts. Leah Hunt Hendricks is not like Matt Schlapp at all. But she is an interesting character in that she is kind of a subterranean Washington figure trying to make it work. And so the book is called The Big Break because Washington went through this big break. That's Donald Trump. That's pre-Donald Trump. It's this kind of chaos we all know by this point. I don't really even need to describe it. But it's also about people who are trying to put something together after the big break to seek out their own big breaks, right? And Leah Hunt Hendricks is one of these people who really came to political power of sorts in the Trump era. She is the granddaughter of H.L. Hunt, who was the richest man in the world when he died, an oil tycoon who was this hardcore right-wing populist, John Birch Society kind of guy. And she is a progressive, hardcore progressive, trying to use her wealth to unwind the kind of project that her grandfather was all about. She was called Occupy's heiress at one point. She was, down at Occupy Wall Street when she was studying solidarity in school. Very smart, very wealthy, but also this kind of person trying to define herself and figure out how to make things work for the country, but also for herself in this weird new abnormal that is post-Trump Washington.
Yeah, I was fascinated because you and I know our listeners have seen the effects of her philanthropy and her role in the progressive world. She's funded a ton of groups. A lot of people go to her when they want seed funding or early funding for a new political project. I think one of them was More Perfect Union. Mm-hmm. Well, I think she was a partial contributor contributor to them, and I'm a huge fan of their output, and I know a lot of our listeners are as well. So you've seen her work, but unlike Schlapp, you don't see her. She's not out front. She's not in the media. She's not rushing to defend, Democratic politicians and everything they do. And I found the roles similar, even though they behave extremely differently.
Yeah. I mean, there's like a kind of rainmaker quality to both of them, which is like, if you can be on this person's good side, you can get money, you can get connections, you can get infrastructure. And what makes her so important on the progressive side is, honestly, and this probably better than I, frankly, but there's money to be fundraised and grassroots support and all sorts of stuff like that on the left. But there aren't a lot of activists who are also independently super wealthy, who know lots of other unbelievably rich people. And so Leah Hunt Hendricks is that person. And so, yes, there are people who can go out there and they can raise $20 from a million people, and they can help you support your organizations or your campaigns. But how many progressives are out there that could call up their friend so-and-so who's a millionaire and get $1 million donated, like that? And Leah could do that and can do that. And in the Trump years, that she could do that almost easily. I mean, the hashtag resistance spigots were wide open during the Trump years, because all you had to do as a lefty basically was say, look, we're not that guy. We are against that guy. We are all on the same team, and the money would pour in. What I was kind of looking at was her role in the Biden years, the quote unquote post-Trump, even though there is no post-Trump. He's still around, very much around, still living in the shadow of Trump in Washington. But in this kind of non-Trump dominated Washington, how did she make it work? It was a lot harder for her to raise money. She was trying to define who she was, help define the party. And that's a lot harder to do. It's important to do, but it's really hard.
There are two other people, and I think we'll come back to all four and how they all have overlapping and similar feelings about their roles in politics. But I also want to hear about Robert Strick and Sean McElwee. And these are two people who, kind of thrust themselves into the spotlight of sorts, more so for Sean through his media maneuvering. But Robert Strick was somebody who didn't really have a lot of political connections before the Trump years, but kind of faked it till he made it and ended up just as a really interesting character in this book, and somebody who I admittedly had never heard of before this. So who are Robert Strick and Sean McElwee for people who may not know?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really good examples of where of the book, right? Which is that they are entertaining characters. Like I want this book to be a fun read. I want people who don't care about Washington so much, who don't think about it all the time, aren't like, reading Roll Call and National Journal and Politico. And I want people like my wife, who cares about the country but does not care about my job, my day job necessarily, to want to read this book and be like, wow, like I'm not an insider, but now I know the insiders and they're effing nuts. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast or not, but
you can. Yeah.
They're fucking nuts, right? And Strick is a great example of somebody that you just, in my opinion, this guy on the page is just, you fly through it because it's like, what is going on here? He's a long-time lobbyist who never really made it work, moved out to Oregon, having not made a lot of money, like started working on a vineyard, and then he owned the vineyard. He tried to run for mayor of a small town, alienated everybody in the small town. They basically ran him out of town. It was like, somebody described it to me as like a bad dream where people in town are still wandering around being like, did that really happen? Did that dude from out of town move here and just yell at everybody and make everybody uncomfortable and run for mayor and then disappear? He's a guy like that who, when Trump ran for president in 2016, he gets on, some low level volunteer gig by basically representing Trump in Oregon, a state that's never going to go for Trump, but he's in the mix, right? He starts to know the people in Trump land. And when Trump wins, this guy is all of a sudden sitting pretty. He literally is sitting in Washington, D.C. a couple days after Trump wins when a dog comes and sniffs his crotch, and a woman comes after the dog and apologizes. And she's got a New Zealand accent. He thinks it's a British accent, but it's a New Zealand accent. And she's mad because she can't connect her country to President Trump. It turns out in Washington, everybody was prepared for Hillary Clinton to be president. That seemed like the natural thing. And when it wasn't her, nobody knew how to do their jobs. Nobody knew how to connect countries with the new president. And Strick, this, cowboy hat wearing, guy who makes, in his words, shitty wine, is sitting there, and he tells her, yeah, well, I can do that for you. And she's like, really? And he's like, yeah, I can do that. And he didn't really know if he could, but he could. It turns out all you needed was to know somebody who had Trump's cell phone number. Boom. He connects the president-elect of the United States with a country, a big deal country. It's not just Flight of the Conchords. Like, it's a big deal to be connected to New Zealand. And when that happens, he's just off and running. He raises more money, I think, or makes more money in kind of contracts with like seedy individuals and unscrupulous countries and probably normal countries, and some good ones, I'm sure, and makes more personal cash almost than any other lobbyist in the Trump years. And I meet up with this guy for the same reason, which is like he put it together in the Trump years, and his story, all that stuff is part of the book because it's incredible material. But I also wanted to know what happened next. It's one thing to be able to make a ton of money when Trump is president because you have a cell phone number and, you're a hustler, like in the sense that he could hustle. What happens when it kind of goes slightly back to normal? And so I spend just a ton of time with him out on his farm. It's called Alibi Farm. He's always drinking whiskey and telling stories and trying to get deals with the Belarusians during wartime. He's quite a character.
And another name that I know our listeners know of, for better or for worse, this is somebody who really did a great job, admittedly, finding his way into media stories over the past few years, built up a polling operation, and ingratiated himself among a lot of influential Democrats and also Sam Bankman-Fried. But in case someone doesn't know, Sean McElwee plays a big role in your book as well. This guy's got gambling, if you want to say addiction, but he loves to gamble. I don't know if we want to diagnose him. But he ultimately ended up maneuvering his way through Washington up and all the way up into White House invitations. Who is Sean McElwee, the person?
So I was interested in Sean before I knew about the gambling or even knew who Sam Bankman-Fried was, frankly. This is a couple of years back. And what was interesting to me is he seemed like a perfect kind of Washington creature for some of the reasons you mentioned. One, he was a rising star in the Democratic Party, and I kept seeing his name pop up places, and he had a real self-promotional streak, could almost be Trump-like in that way, and that he would say controversial things and think all press was good press. And, he was building a brand, right? And did I like that brand? I don't know, but I certainly couldn't stop seeing it. And I was like, well, this guy feels like somebody's either going to make it in Washington or Washington is going to absolutely destroy him. Like he's going to, set himself on fire. And so that was interesting to me. He was a young Democratic pollster, ran a think tank called Data for Progress, was a hardcore lefty in 2018, 2019, hosting, dirtbag left happy hours in Brooklyn and wearing Bernie Sanders hats and Karl Marx shirts and talking about abolish ICE and moving the Overton window. And then when Biden became president and it was like all the power was kind of being a bit more moderate, a bit more pragmatic, that's what Sean became. He became the guy who basically said, don't say defund the police. Instead of being the guy who said abolish ICE, he took on the opposite role. And that was like a very Washington move. And so I just wanted to see what happened. And it turns out like there's a lot going on. And I would go to his poker nights and his happy hours. But it was the poker nights that I really got the material that I felt like is at the heart of his story in the book, which is his gambling. And it wasn't just betting on cards. He was betting on politics. And he wasn't just betting on politics. He was betting on elections. And he wasn't just betting on elections. He was betting on elections that he had done polling for. It was like, it's not, people kept calling it like insider trading. I don't think it's quite insider trading. It's not the same thing, that has very legal ramifications, but it certainly felt like, at the very least, like Pete Rose betting on baseball while playing baseball. And in some ways worse because Pete Rose at least maintained that he wasn't betting on his own games. And Sean had a rationale for it. He said it wasn't just because he was a degenerate gambler, which an ex-girlfriend of his told me that she thought he was. He said that it was because it made him a better pollster. If he put money in a race, he had skin in the game. If he lost, he would not forget that loss, and he would think to himself, okay, how can I be better? How can I not make that mistake? That's fine. It's an interesting idea, but ultimately clients, aren't going to like it when you're betting against them. And some clients aren't going to like it if you're betting at all. Not to mention the fact that he was encouraging his young staff to bet, and it became kind of, a scandal.
That was a scandal, and you reveal that he ended up betting the wrong way on a lot of the races in 2022. He was certain that a lot of these Democratic victories were going to be losses, and you see his, fallout from Data for Progress and the betting scandal, and also his association with Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX's collapse. And also at the same time you're writing this, which is really just masterful work by you, because from what I gather, it's incredibly difficult to write a book and work on it for years and also make it relevant when it comes out and newsworthy and timely when it comes out. And you did that because Schlapp also had his own set of scandals. And I think for a few people, if not all of them, there was these comments made to you about their reflection on the past couple of years as throughout your conversations, whether they felt they would do things the same way, whether they felt the relationships that they thought they had were genuine and still intact. What was your observation as you the growth of these people or the changes that these people had gone through? You seem to tie it all together, but I'm wondering if you could give listeners some perspective from your side on what these people went through and how they thought back on these past couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I think one of my big takeaways was just, how personal politics is. People think of Washington, especially old Washington, as a place that's just a game, and everybody goes and they yell during the day and they get their drinks at night and they laugh about, the performance they put on, which is itself gross, obviously. But I think there's less of that in some ways now. Some people are still playing games for sure, but a lot of it now is just so personal, and people don't necessarily realize that you can be a young, idealistic lefty who goes to work for a place like Data for Progress and deeply want to change the world. And the fact that your politics gets wrapped up in gambling and a leader of the institution that you think that you trust and you think of as almost like a mentor, and then when you're let down by him and you feel like you've lost yourself a little bit to Washington, like that's heartbreaking and personal and difficult and dramatic. And I think there's just a lot of those stories in this book. A lot of people who come to Washington with one idea of who they are and what they want to be. And Washington, especially this post-Trump period where everything is so heightened, just kind of wrings them out. Some people can get out of it okay with their relationships intact and with their values intact. But I just spent a lot of time with people who I just feel like we're losing themselves in Washington, and in some cases very quickly. And it wasn't until the end of the year when some of these spells were broken that people could actually, reflect on that. After dramatic conclusions to people's stories, could people say, yeah, that was bad?
On that quickly point, is this, McElwee had this almost meteoric rise, and now I don't know what he's up to now. Maybe you do, but it's certainly not the same that it was a year or two ago. Do you think this reflects like a new volatile nature of Washington and politics for people who are trying to make it and make a name for themselves? Or were these just, bright stars who burnt out the fastest?
I think that it's a really hard time right now to not burn out in Washington. Everything is existential. And there are real threats to democracy. There are real stakes here. I mean, you've seen what the Supreme Court has done to a woman's right to choose, for example. It's not like we're not talking about little around the edges things where if one party wins or another party wins, life will be basically the same. Like there are really big stakes here. And I think because of that, some people can get lost in that and they can burn out. And then other people take advantage of that because they know that everybody is so desperate for answers. If they can act like they provide those answers, it can make them wealthy, it can make them influential, it can get them in the room. And if people are there for the wrong reasons, I think a lot of times you'll see them burn out.
One of the idealists who I think time has proven right that we haven't talked about yet was Jamarcus Pearley. And this is a young man who worked on the Hill, filmed himself, I think, smoking a blunt in Feinstein's office. And his concerns that he was trying to raise as he quit in a blaze of glory was that she's not all there, doesn't care about her constituents, and people know this is happening, but don't care. You know, the past few months especially, we've seen reporting that have really validated his concerns, and people didn't listen to him. Maybe it was the medium or how he approached it, but, you know, he certainly wasn't the first person to talk about it, but now there's a magnifying glass on her and her performance and her cognitive abilities. What is Jamarcus Pearley's story after leaving Feinstein? I mean, he seemed disillusioned with the entire city and the system.
Yeah, it's honestly kind of sad. He was an idealistic guy when he came to Washington, young black guy from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, went to Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford. Brilliant guy, worked for Feinstein for 5 years, had big designs on, how to make change, from the inside and work his way through the system, and felt completely disillusioned by it. Like you said, broke into her office and smoked a joint at her desk after taking a bunch of psilocybin mushrooms, I'll mention. It was a protest that didn't really work out. I mean, it was a complicated one. He was hoping to go viral and then have a bunch of people come and talk to him so he could explain himself. And not that many people did. I was sort of one of very few. Another guy, Pablo Manriquez, deserves credit. He did a big interview with him for a website called Latino Rebels. But mainstream media didn't really pick it up at all. And last I talked to him was actually just a couple weeks ago. And he was back in Pine Bluff working at the middle school that he went to, and having a tough time down there because, it's poor and not a lot of resources, he said, were going to the school. He felt like everybody at the school was struggling to educate these kids and give them what they need, and were feeling kind of left behind. And he said watching what was going on with Feinstein now has been kind of heartbreaking for him. He says that this protest he feels like was one of the best things that he ever did, most important things he ever did, and nothing came of it. He called for her to step down or for people to recognize, where she was mentally, among other things, and nothing came of it. And now, the last time I talked to him was shortly after AOC, I believe, or Ro Khanna. There were others who made statements about, maybe it's time for somebody new. And he was like, even people in the squad, even Ro Khanna are calling for this, and nothing is changing. And so if I can't change anything with the most dramatic thing I've ever done, if people in Congress can't change anything, then who can change things? Who can actually make something happen here? And, that's a tough thing. He's wondering if it was all worth it. The only person's life who changed from that moment was his. He now worries, again, he doesn't regret the video, I don't believe, and it's his story, not mine. But he told me that he doesn't regret the video, but he wonders if it will follow him forever and not affect anyone else.
The change point, you talk about a bipartisan police bill in this book that people who worked on it on the Hill thought actually could pass. And then suddenly a draft leaks to a sheriff's union, and suddenly I think it was Tim Scott withdraws his backing of this bill. Do you think, this is an example of how things, even where all the pieces are in place, or something like this, people didn't think could pass, could make it. Do you think things actually can change, or are we just kind of on this path where, to go back to your earlier point, everything being existential, the rhetoric is, turned up to 11, everything's hyperbolic? Is that just the system we're going to live in perpetuity? I
know that I've been watching too much of I Think You Should Leave with Tim Robinson, when the first thing I think of is, I'm worried the baby thinks that people can't change. I do think that people and the baby can change, and the people that the baby's looking at can change. I think Washington can change and affect change and make change. One of the things about the place that I think people get wrong is a lot of people outside of Washington think that nothing ever gets done here because people don't care. All they care about is themselves and their own, electoral prospects and their own ability to rise. And there is a lot of that, and that is often what makes things ultimately die. And that might be the case with the police reform bill. But it's also filled with lots and lots and lots and lots of people who care immensely. And that bill, that's what made that story such a heartbreaker, really, is that there were so many people who cared, both in Tim Scott's office and Cory Booker's office. These were the two senators that were working kind of hardest on it, led by two chiefs of staff, women of color, who stayed up late, cried, desperately trying to get something to happen. And when it didn't happen, both of them were basically like, I feel like the violence that continues after this, like, we could have helped stop that. Like, that's really hard to live with. But ultimately, you need people like who don't want to be president necessarily working on some of these things, because it's possible that you start worrying, I could pass this bill. It might be good for, a little bit of reform, but will it hang around my neck if I run for president? Not blaming all of this on Tim Scott. I wasn't in the room. I don't know. But one of the concerns that the people in Booker's office had when I talked to them was, well, we thought he might want to run for president. And when it ultimately leaked and he used that as an excuse to get out of it, it seemed like the kind of machinations that might happen if someone were to run for higher office. And he is running for president right now.
And, we have some sort of an update on his virginity, or maybe his lack of virginity now, thanks to your reporting.
That's true. I can tell you about it if you'd like.
Thank you for your service. I actually do. What was his reaction?
Well, this was a while back when I asked him this question. I profiled him years ago when he was a congressman, and he was, in his 40s. But I'd found some clips from his early days as a state representative, I believe, or a town councilman in Charleston, South Carolina, when he was 30 years old, and he would go around to schools talking about abstinence and how important it was to save yourself until marriage. And he used his personal story saying, I'm not married and I'm a virgin and it's important to me. And I think it's a virtue that you guys should all, consider. Basically, you should also be virgins until you get married. And when I met with him as a 40-something-year-old, he still had never been married. And he still today has never been married. And it felt like that's fair game. I don't know. It was really weird because I never anticipated asking a congressman if he'd ever been laid before. It just wasn't really on my, bingo card. But it felt kind of like it fair game. Like, once you're a guy who publicly goes around talking about this, I think you can ask about it, and he could say, I don't want to talk about it. And his reaction at first was, I don't want to talk about my sex life with Ben Terris or anybody else. And then very weirdly, he stood up from his desk and said, I have to go potty. And then he left and went to the bathroom. Weirdest thing ever. I looked at his communication director, who I remember giving me one of those Jim Halperin shrugs. I guess he had to go potty. I don't know.
It's potty time.
Yeah. I mean, it's potty. And a guy who may or may not have had sex, but definitely did not have kids, saying potty seems strange to me. He came back, and basically his response was, I'd asked him if it was a virtue that he still adhered to. It was an easier way than saying, have you ever had sex? And he said, maybe not as well as I would have liked. I think people should all have patience, but, not everybody does. And I would still go around to schools talking about abstinence, but maybe I wouldn't talk about my own story anymore, which was his sort of everyone's talking about how Tim Scott is trying to have it both ways now with Trump, be with him and against him at the same time. This was sort of like Schrodinger's virginity. He was both a virgin and not a virgin at the same time. And he could kind of have it both ways, I think, in that moment.
Oh, God, if that isn't the quintessential DC response to something. Oh, man. Ben, what do you want people's takeaway to be from this book? What's something that we haven't talked about that you want them to leave with?
Well, first of all, I do want people to enjoy this book, right? There's a lot of Washington coverage right now that is very serious, and it is disastrous times. I mean, we are in an apocalypse right now. The whole city is covered in smog. People are wearing masks outside instead of inside now. The whole things are bad overall. And there's a lot of books that do a great job of letting you know how serious it is. And I think we all know that. And I think that people deserve to laugh their way through it a little bit instead of just crying their way through it. And so I want people to read this book and be like, have the experience almost like you had while watching Veep, right? Which was you'd laugh your ass off at these like craven, crazy characters, and then he'd also be like, that was kind of fucked up. Like this is if that were real, that's a bad situation. This is real. This is a real book. And I think people at the end of it will be like, DC's not quite ready for what's next. We need to prepare better as a country, as a capital. There are things that can be done to safeguard democracy and pass better legislation and be a better country. And we should probably get on that. But also, that was fun. It's a tough thing to do both.
And you did it well. It was a blast, and I learned a lot along the way. I really enjoyed it. I just couldn't stop listening to it. The Big Break: The Gamblers, Party Animals, and True Believers Trying to Win in Washington While America Loses Its Mind is available now. Ben, where can people get it, and where can they follow you and find more of your work?
You can get it wherever fine books are sold, I believe is what people say sometimes on radios and podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at @bterris. I spent a year during this book leave not on Twitter, and it was amazing. But now that I have to tell people about this book, you can find me there again.
Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.